what have I done? Okay, well, perhaps we might get started fairly soon and jump into things. So we've got the recording started. In case you've only just jumped in, we are recording the session. So just be aware of that if you don't want your video on, for example, but otherwise, I think we should just kick things off because we've only got an hour and a half. So I would like to welcome you all and thank you for tuning in to this workshop session on US militarization of Australia and the Asia Pacific as part of this World Peace Congress. And I'd like to thank IPAN, so the Independent Peaceful Australia Network, for having convened and organised our workshop today. My name's Matilda Byrne and I'm from SafeGround, who's one of IPAN's member organisations, and I'm facilitating the session today from Melbourne. I want to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nation, whose lands I am on currently, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, as I recognise as well that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to extend my acknowledgement to the Indigenous peoples of wherever you may be participating from and located at the moment. And I guess take this time to reflect on often the connection to land, waterways, culture, and so on that these groups have. As I mentioned, I'm based at SafeGround, where our mandate is about promoting peace and security in keeping land and their people safe and restoring unsafe ground. And so this resonates with us a lot. And we are in a really timely moment to be having this discussion about US militarization of Australia already, and also the Asia Pacific region. Already in the chat, there's been a couple of questions put forward about the AUKUS Pact, and there'll be opportunities throughout for people to ask questions. There's obviously other, recent policy announcements that are raising a lot of questions about this space, but indeed there's also practices over a long period of time which seem to be at odds, really, with achieving stability in the region and even peace, and decisions by Australian policymakers that are tethered to an alliance with the US that impacts our ability to assert independent and peaceful policies in the region to the detriment of the region. And I guess today we're going to hear from a few different speakers, as well as discussing initiatives and having time to talk about actions that are taking place in the region or beyond, and hear from you as participants about what is being done to promote demilitarization, peace, and other issues, and share about ideas, challenges, possible avenues for collaboration. And so before we have that conversation, we are going to be starting with speakers. So to begin with, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Vince Scappatura, who is a lecturer in politics and international relations at Macquarie University. His book, The US Lobby and Australian Defence Policy, examines the impact of US influence on Australia. And now I'll hand over to him to give us, I guess, really an overview and start the discussion on the topic of today's workshop. So thank you, Vince.
Thank you very much, Matilda, for that introduction. And I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I'm presenting to you today, the Darramurrugal or Daru people. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I'd like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen because I do have some slides to share with you. So hopefully you can see that okay. So the title of this workshop is Increasing US Militarization of Australia and the Asia Pacific. But of course, I think it's worthwhile beginning by acknowledging that US militarization of the Asia Pacific has been a constant feature of the region for decades, stretching back to the post-World War II San Francisco system, or hub and spokes network of bilateral defence alliances and partnerships. key among them being Japan, South Korea, Australia, Taiwan, and the Philippines. The most prominent and long-standing feature of American militarization of the region, of course, are the hundreds of foreign military bases that he has long maintained, with US forces concentrated, but not limited to Japan, primarily Okinawa, South Korea, Guam, and more recently Australia. The US has also long maintained close defence ties and access to defence facilities in many more countries in the region, and uses access to airfields and ports to rotate its military forces periodically, including through Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, several Pacific Island states. The US Indo-Pacific Area of Responsibility, as it has since been renamed. I know the title of the workshop is Asia-Pacific, but US Indo-Pacific Command is the new adopted name. It comprises of 36 countries, indicated on the image on the slide. Maintains a force of 375,000 military and civilian personnel, 200 ships, including 5 aircraft carrier strike groups and 1,100 aircraft. These forces are almost constantly engaged in joint military exercises or war games with numerous countries throughout the region. The US officially holds 90 named military exercises in the Indo-Pacific each year, but it's been recorded that there are in fact many more than even that. Australia and the US, for example, conduct at least 16 joint military exercises together each year alone, just in the Indo-Pacific region. And complementing these joint military exercises are hundreds of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions undertaken by US air, land, and sea forces, primarily in the South China Sea, along China's coast, along with so-called freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs. In terms of the Australia-US alliance, it has been the cornerstone of Australia's defence and foreign policy since the Second World War, and is buttressed by the ANZUS Defence Pact, which was signed by Australia, New Zealand, and the US in 1951. It's celebrating its 70th anniversary this year. Australia considers itself to be one of, if not the most loyal American ally. The government incessantly boasts at every opportunity that it has participated in every major US war since World War I, maintains that the US has no closer friend or ally. Most recently, our Prime Minister described our relationship with the US as a forever partnership. Australia has long relied on the US for its major military and defence equipment, participates with the US in joint military research, maintains high levels of interoperability with US forces by joint military exercises, and hundreds of Australian military personnel are embedded within the US military at any particular moment. Australia has long been a part of the exclusive and peerless, in terms of capabilities, Five Eyes intelligence group, which consists of the Anglosphere countries of the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. One of the nodes of the global Five Eyes surveillance system, and probably the most important US intelligence facility outside of the United States, has been located since the 1960s at Pine Gap in Central Australia. And you can see a spectacular image of the large radomes of Pine Gap on the slide. Along with intercepting foreign military and civilian communications, Pine Gap plays a central role in US nuclear war planning, missile defense, space warfare, and drone assassinations. It has long been considered the heart or strategic essence of the alliance, and along with Naval Communication Station at Northwest Cape in Western Australia, ties Australia automatically to any US war. It's the primary reason Australia refuses to sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And incidentally, Pine Gap remains a high priority nuclear target of any major US adversary. Okay, so that was just a very brief and very incomplete picture of long-standing US military dominance in Australia and the Indo-Pacific region as a whole. But I wanted to sketch that out as the background to, that's the status quo before talking about increasing US militarization of the region that has taken place in more recent years, and in the specific context of the rise of China and growing strategic and economic rivalry between the US and China. We can trace the origins of America's anti-China military buildup in the Indo-Pacific as far back as 2001, when the George W. Bush administration, prior to 9/11, first officially called attention to China's growing military power and foresaw that it might come to pose a challenge to US power projection capabilities and dominance in the South China Sea. In particular, advancements in precision missile technologies, it was feared, might one day prevent US forces' freedom of maneuver in China's air and maritime approaches. This is otherwise known as anti-access area denial, or A2AD capabilities. In order to address this concern, the Bush administration quietly proceeded to expand US bases in Guam and Hawaii, relocate naval assets to the region, including an additional aircraft carrier, and work to build up the defense capabilities and interoperability of its allies and partners. And it did so quietly because it was still committed to engaging with China, particularly economically. Interestingly, an early classified internal review actually called for the development of new long-range arms to be deployed around China in an act of preemption or dissuasion. But that objective was diverted by the September 11 attacks and the subsequent war on terror. That idea was incidentally subsequently revived by the Trump administration some 16 years later, and I'll speak to that in a moment. So the Obama administration significantly accelerated the Bush administration's muted rebalance to Asia, but with greater fanfare and determination to extricate the US from the costly wars in the Middle East, not so successfully, but then to pivot to Asia. So the pivot included the announcement to increase US Navy and Air Force presence in the Asia-Pacific from 50 to 60%, further extend US defense ties, increase US defense exports, engage in more frequent US warship visits, and the expansion of joint military exercises. The most concrete element of the pivot was the announcement of a new 2,500 strong Marine Air Ground Task Force to be based in Darwin in Northern Australia. The fact that Obama chose Parliament House in Canberra to announce the pivot was viewed as highly symbolic and indicative of the important role Australia was set to play in America's emerging containment strategy of China. A central but less well-known element of the pivot that the Obama administration oversaw was the development of a new warfighting operational concept to overcome China's now maturing missile capabilities and A2AD system. This new concept was dubbed Air-Sea Battle. Controversially included the objective of launching from afar thousands of strikes against critical military targets deep within Chinese territory. The plan also called for US allies to impose a blockade of China in the event of war, with Australian naval forces, surface ships, submarines, and ISR aircraft, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance aircraft, well positioned to deploy to regional choke points. A point that takes on even more significance in light of the recent AUKUS agreement, which I'll come to at the end of my presentation. It's also worth noting, too, that it was the Obama administration that undertook the first so-called FONOP, or Freedom of Navigation operation, within 12 nautical miles of disputed Chinese built-up islands in the South China Sea. And these accelerated under the Trump administration, and they've resulted in very dangerous military encounters between US and Chinese armed forces. While the Obama administration very publicly set the agenda for increasing US militarization of the region in the context of the rise in China, it wavered somewhat between constraining and engaging China economically in what some have referred to as a policy of engagement. And so it took the boldness, and I would say recklessness, of the Trump administration to officially elevate China to a strategic competitor and revisionist power that threatened US preeminence. The Trump administration initiated a more explicit effort at containing China economically with trade sanctions and attempts to decouple supply chains and so forth, but also from a strategic perspective identified China as the new pacing threat with which to focus US military modernization efforts. So unlike Obama's Air-Sea Battle concept, which never really resulted in significant force structure adjustments, the Trump administration directed the armed services to retool themselves for a conflict with China under the new warfighting doctrine, Joint All-Domain Operations, which has resulted in significant militarization of the region in terms of weapons platforms, missile systems, new military units, joint military exercises, and so on. And I'll speak to some of those more in a moment. But just to give you one very significant example of the implications of this new warfighting strategy and an anti-China military buildup, the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia, which was a Cold War arms limitation treaty that prohibited the stationing of ground-launched missiles between 500 and 5,000 kilometers in Europe, that was done so with the intention to create a ring of such missiles around China in the Indo-Pacific, in accordance with these new operational warfighting doctrines. The development and testing of these ballistic cruise and hypersonic missiles is ongoing at the moment, and the first missiles apparently will be ready for deployment within the next couple of years if the US can find anyone who's willing to host them. The final innovation of the Trump administration was the quadrilateral security dialogue between the US, Japan, Australia, and India. And it's just another exercise in increasing and coordinating defense ties and economic policies in a kind of containment strategy of China. So the Biden administration came to power committing itself to effectively continuing the Trump administration's blueprint for containing China, without the over-the-top and childish inflammatory rhetoric, and with a greater commitment to multilateralism as opposed to Trump's nationalist unilateralism. The Biden administration's primary objective has been to coalesce US allies and partners into taking America's side in this budding Cold War with China. They're essentially returning to a beefed up kind of pivot to Asia without actually calling it that. Many of the architects of the pivot are in fact in the many of the architects of the pivot in the Obama administration are now back in the Biden administration. But they are also continuing the Trump administration's assertive innovations, including, the designation of China as the pacing threat, the implementation of these new operational concepts, missile deployments in the region, and so forth. And you can see clear evidence of this in the Pentagon's recent $27 billion Pacific Deterrence Initiative, which was first announced during the Trump administration as a $2.2 billion initiative and has subsequently been significantly beefed up under the Biden administration. That plan provides for the forward deployment of precision strike fires distributed along the first island chain around China, which you might just be able to see marked in pink on that image on the slide, along with new missile defense systems in Guam and power projection capabilities in Micronesia, Palau, and the Marshall Islands. The Pacific Deterrence Initiative dovetails with the new modernization efforts and warfighting operational concepts I mentioned earlier, and which includes the deployment of newly structured Army and Marine units operating within and around the first island chain surrounding China, armed with mobile, long-range precision fires that can kind of quickly get in and out, hopping from island to island to avoid detection. The US Army has already begun utilizing one of its 5 planned MDTFs, or multi-domain task forces, depicted there in the slide, if you can see it, in the Indo-Pacific region, but they have not yet made a decision about where they will finally be forward deployed to. And of course, the major new initiative of the Biden administration is the recently announced AUKUS security partnership, which undoubtedly will be the signature initiative of the administration and a signal coming soon after withdrawal from Afghanistan that it is 100% committed to pivoting to Asia. Okay, so just in the time that I have left, I'd like to focus on recent developments in the militarization of Australia specifically. The first thing to note is that Australia is considered by the United States to be strategically located to build up its force projection capabilities because it is outside of the range of most of China's conventional missile capabilities, unlike major US bases in Japan, South Korea, and Guam. An influential Washington-based think tank described Australia back in 2013 as a gateway to the Indo-Pacific and a bridging power for the US to preserve its influence in Asia. It predicted, perhaps presciently, that the US-Australia relationship may well prove to be the most special relationship of the 21st century. In any case, that was essentially the geostrategic logic that informed the decision of the Obama administration to forward deploy the 2,500 Marine Air Ground Task Force to Darwin back in 2011. And our defense minister recently announced that Australia is keen to see the number of US troops in Australia increase. And I expect we'll hear something about that sooner rather than later. The US Marines in Australia constitute one of 2 US force posture initiatives. The other is what's called the Enhanced Air Cooperation Agreement that facilitates the rotation of US air elements in Northern Australia. Recently, the Australian government announced $1.4 billion in upgrades to defence infrastructure in Northern Australia to support both of these initiatives, including extension of runways, fuel and weapons depots to support US long-range bombers. And as part of the recent AUKUS agreement, it was announced that there would be a major expansion of the force posture initiatives to include the rotation of all types of US aircraft to Australia, along with enhanced land and maritime cooperation. The Australian government is also expected to spend an estimated $100 billion in missile purchases over the next 20 years, including in hypersonic missiles. Australia and the US are currently conducting joint research into hypersonic missiles, which are slated to be ready for deployment as early as 2023. And once again, the recent AUKUS agreement included the intention to create a joint defence research and industrial base between the US, UK, and Australia, particularly focused on emerging technologies, missile technologies, but also artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing, and so on. Australia is currently fast-tracking the creation of a local missile manufacturing industry to be ready within the next 3 years, with the intention of slotting Australia into the supply chains of American arms companies, using American missile designs, but manufacturing them here in Australia for use by Australia, but also to sell back to the US. Thereby helping to achieve the government's previously announced ambition to become one of the world's top 10 weapons exporters. And students of mine from Macquarie University, who are here online at the moment, in partnership with the Medical Association for the Prevention of War, are going to be speaking to that issue more directly in a moment. But this missile buildup, which includes the purchase of US Tomahawk cruise missiles, long-range air to surface and anti-ship missiles, and long-range precision fires for the Army, are all intended to complement the new US warfighting operational doctrines against China that I've been speaking of. And in fact, during the recent biennial Talisman Sabre joint military exercises, which typically consist of over 34,000 American and Australian military personnel, the Australian Defence Force trained with the US Army's new multi-domain task force, including with the high mobility artillery rocket system, which is the centerpiece of the new strategy. The ADF reportedly took on a crucial command and control role that was a kind of a preview in miniature of the multi-domain operations the US Army envisions in a future war against China. And Australia has expressed interest in purchasing its own HIMARS batteries as well. Okay, so I haven't really left much time to talk about AUKUS, unfortunately, but I'm more than happy to discuss the many implications of the agreement in the Q&A if people are interested to know more. I've already mentioned parts of the agreement, which include greater rotation of US military forces in Australia, joint defence research and expanded joint military exercises. But I haven't yet mentioned the centerpiece of the agreement, whereby Australia will be the first non-nuclear weapons state to acquire submarine nuclear reactor technology from the United States. The implications of the agreement for Australia are very, very serious, in my opinion. Leaving aside the nuclear proliferation risks or the potential for it to contribute to an undersea arms race, which are also important implications, and which we can discuss perhaps in the Q&A. But in terms of the cost to Australia, it's patently clear that the submarines are not intended for the defence of Australia. Diesel-powered submarines would be just as, if not more, appropriate for that task. The only real advantage of nuclear subs are their speed and endurance, which is only important if you intend to deploy them far from your homeland for long periods. In Australia's case, it's been made quite clear that the US expects Australia to deploy these submarines as part of a larger US strike group in the South China Sea in a conflict with China. And given that China relies on its nuclear-powered and armed submarines to maintain a second strike nuclear capability, and is already highly vulnerable to superior US anti-submarine warfare capabilities, particularly as Chinese subs are hemmed into the shallow waters of the South China Sea by America's so-called fishhook array of sensors, which is depicted on the slide there. Australia's decision to acquire these submarines is incredibly provocative, and I'm sure will haunt us for some time to come. So there are many more aspects of the AUKUS agreement that are worth discussing, but I'm going to have to leave it there for the moment because I've run out of time. I'll just leave you with this quote from Professor Richard Tanta, who is undoubtedly the most authoritative expert on US bases in Australia. He wrote this shortly after the Obama administration announced the pivot to Asia and the announcement of the 2,500 Marine Air Ground Task Force to Darwin. After reviewing the previous 10 years of continuous developments in increasing Australia-US defence ties, he wrote the following: "The result of these policies and force structure changes may well be, from a Chinese perspective, that Australia is not so much hosting US military bases, but is becoming a virtual American base in its own right." It was probably true almost 10 years ago, but it is certainly true today. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Vince, for that really comprehensive snapshot of the topic that has so much going on. I think from the policy environment, the posturing, specifically militarisation in Australia, that was all really great. And we do have some questions that have come up about the AUKUS Pact, some of which you spoke to, and I think others we can tease out, like you said, in the Q&A. So what I might do now is I was asked as well maybe to just add a few comments or remarks on this issue of US militarization in Australia and the region in the context of autonomous weapons and increasing autonomous weaponry. So SafeGround is the lead of the Australian effort as part of the global campaign to stop killer robots. And like all other defense issues, really, the US influence is ever present and a real obstacle to regulation and indeed avoiding a potential arms race. So for people who are unaware, autonomous weapons are regarded often now as the third revolution of warfare, so following gunpowder and the atomic bomb. And autonomous weapons integrate robotics and artificial intelligence and other sort of computer systems. And where fully autonomous weapons, or you might have heard them called like lethal autonomous weapon systems or killer robots, are weapon systems which would see the weapon select and engage targets, so deciding what to fire upon, who to fire upon, whether or not to fire, indeed on something or someone, without any human control. And so this raises moral problems as well as ethical and legal issues and security risks related to machine error, but also more broadly escalation, intensification of warfare, lowering the barriers to war. And despite this, the US and a few others are seeking to limit regulation as much as possible in the area of autonomous weapons. So the campaign to stop killer robots is advocating for specific prohibitions and then other obligations regarding autonomous weapons to prevent sort of what I just mentioned from occurring. And the majority of states are supporting this kind of initiative and want to see a legally binding instrument, so a new treaty to regulate in this area. And a very few don't, that are excited by this technology and want to be able to innovate sort of on an open slather, if you will. And so we've just mentioned the AUKUS Pact, and this obviously includes defense ties, but also technology sharing, among which is artificial intelligence. And so it's probably unsurprising that the UK and Australia both share very similar positions with the US on the issue of autonomous weapons and during the diplomatic talks that are currently taking place, and are, as a consequence, acting very slowly on regulation of kind of any kind in this space, which is rapidly evolving and needs to be addressed urgently. And then in addition, you also have India and Japan among these very few countries, the small group. For context, the other countries are Israel and Russia, that are sort of stopping progress on regulation of autonomous weapons. And so this goes back to the Quad Alliance, which Vince just mentioned, between Australia, US, India and Japan. That's all about sort of posturing against China. And so it's then these countries, these few countries that are stalling progress in the international arena, while the vast majority of the world is calling for negotiations of a new instrument and wanting to act to prevent moral, legal, and security risks. And yet, the US want to and are developing in this area very rapidly. And so the desire to increase autonomy in a way that is uninhibited is influencing policy and preventing international progress and encouraging militarization at this moment, which is very, I think, pivotal and crucial for humanity. And so I know that is a very, very brisk sort of motor through some of the issues there in relation to that. But I guess the important point that I highlighted is the one that I just made around the US's influence in this space and influence over, a small group of countries in the region, our region, Asia-Pacific. And if you want to know more about the issue of increasing autonomy in the campaign to stop killer robots, I can put some information in the chat. But otherwise, I'll leave it there just to, I guess, tease out a very modern and, I guess, emerging issue that still very much fits within the context of this conversation. And so from there, what I'll do is hand over and welcome Kellie Tranter, And so Kellie is a lawyer and human rights activist who regularly contributes to Australian political and social commentary in Australian media and public affairs websites and publications. She's also the chairperson of the National People's Inquiry into the Costs and Consequences of the Australia-US Alliance, which is currently being conducted. And so, Kellie, if you could take it away.
Thank you, Matilda. I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, in my case, the Wunarua people, and I pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past and present and to leaders yet to emerge, and acknowledge the land was never ceded. Thank you to the Independent Peaceful Australia Network, Annette, Ross and others, and the International Peace Bureau for the opportunity to speak this evening, and to Vince, who has put out this very fine book. If you can see it there, I know he won't plug it, so I will, and Matilda. May I also congratulate the students at Macquarie University in Sydney for their research in collaboration with the Medical Association for the Prevention of War, ALICE West, into the harm caused by Australian exports of weapons. It feels like a lifetime ago that I was trying to piece together the Australian government's defence exports regime. My research was being reported because it had uncovered the scale of export certificates to the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, countries accused of war crimes in Yemen. I'm very pleased that many others collaboratively have continued and are continuing this important work. At about that time, I was also digging deeper into the outcomes of Australian airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. The response to one of my early Freedom of Information requests on defence was that, quote, the department does not specifically collect authoritative and therefore accurate data on enemy and or civilian casualties in either Iraq or Syria, and certainly does not track such statistics, close quote. But my research wasn't in vain. I kept going, and in that case, it formed the basis of a larger story which nudged defence into publishing a fortnightly report summarising the targets and locations of Australian airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. So I say to the Macquarie University students, I look forward to reading about the positive changes you prompt by your researchers in advancing us towards a world without war. I think Vince succinctly described the nature of US militarisation of Australia in the Asia-Pacific region. The United States certainly wants allies to be hostile towards China in order to achieve American objectives. That much is said in the 2018 Global Trends in Democracy Background US Policy and Issue for Congress report, where, quote, it says, in reality, US alliances and partnerships have been deeply rooted in American self-interest by enlisting other nations in the promotion of a world favourable to American interests. They have reduced the price America pays for global leadership and enhanced the advantages America enjoys over any geopolitical rival. And although these alliances and partnerships have required the persistent use of diplomacy, economic power, and other tools of statecraft, they have ultimately rested on a foundation of military strength, close quote. So AUKUS and ANZUS are designed to facilitate US hegemony, to legitimise what the US is doing, fueled by US exceptionalism and paranoia. Could this be the legacy of large-scale mass surveillance of every citizen in the world? In other words, have the spies been spooked by their own shadow? Not only does an increased presence give the United States greater control over the Australian political process, we are eagerly assisting the United States to achieve its ambition of Australia becoming a major base for US bombers, naval vessels, and military personnel, and hence an obvious target in any war, as Vince pointed out, without any proper examination of Australia's separate economic, political, and strategic interests. Pine Gap, the top secret US spy installation near Alice Springs, the largest US intelligence base outside the United States, is a classic example. Since it began operating in the early 1970s, Australia has been denied access to its facilities and operations and misled by calculated omissions and more than occasional lies about the nature and purpose of its activities. What started as a facility for space research as the public were told, translated to arms control, satellite monitoring of nuclear weapons, and other potentially dangerous military activities. Then it was one for intercepting secret foreign power and military communications as well. Then it also became a collector and processor of widespread communications data, enabling its use for purely offensive military objectives like targeting drone strikes and incidentally killing hundreds of innocent men, women, and children on the other side of the world. It has been involved in every US war since 9/11. At the moment, we know it does all of this as a vital fighting base for the US military, providing real-time intelligence support for US military combatant commands, with the result that for the last decade, to quote the late Professor Desball, quote, "We're now linked into this global network where intelligence and operations have become essentially fused, and Pine Gap is a key node in that whole network. That war machine, if you want to use that term, which is doing things which are very, very difficult, I think, as an Australian to justify," close quote. That's quoted from a very worthwhile article by Richard Tanta, published in Nautilus on 21 January this year. Pine Gap is also a route for channeling, analysing and distributing unimaginable quantities of data down to the level of any individual cell phone vacuumed up by US spy satellites, including the data of Australians. None of this information has been volunteered to the Australian public, even in general terms. We, and in that expression, I think I can include our elected representatives, only discovered the last bit through the Snowden revelations. What's next? Arnhem Space Centre, the nearby launch site, which undoubtedly will be capable of launching hypersonic missiles with nuclear warheads, and in which NASA and US defence contractors are involved, expects to be launching next year. Either Pine Gap or the rocket launch site alone should be seen as an obvious target in any potential conflict. Together, they're a nuclear bullseye, but still we can't be trusted with the truth about what's going on, so we have no way of knowing whether these things are in our interests or actually against them. And I must say, I have a copy of the note, they're called a note, signed by Alexander Downer in 1998, which extended the life of Pine Gap. It's a one-page document, extended the life of Pine Gap for 10 years. But what was extraordinary is that we failed to remember that Pine Gap, the facility itself, can be closed by either party with 3 years' notice. So there's an out. And I think that's an out that should be seized by campaigners. There's a case to be made about for the closure of Pine Gap on the basis of national interest. The WikiLeaks cables that were released in relation to infrastructures that was important to the national security of the United States didn't even list Pine Gap as being essential to the security of the United States, which is astounding. So I feel like in the campaign going forward, Pine Gap should be a target for FOI requests, calling for the closure. The agreement itself gives us scope to call for the closure because it provides, the end, that there can be an end to that facility and its existence. One way of defining Australia's national interests, not one that I necessarily agree with, is Australia's ability to do business anywhere, but particularly in the region, cheaply and its own terms. Even if it means turning a blind eye to human rights abuses or criticising other nations of engaging in the very conduct we've been engaged in for decades, for example, in East Timor and West Papua. The Defence incoming brief to Peter Dutton includes this, quote, "While the post-Cold War order will be characterised by an increasingly assertive and powerful China, contesting and constraining China's efforts to assert regional dominance will require more effective networks of cooperation, both in our region and globally. These networks cannot rely only on partnering with nations that share our values. They must be interest-based. To balance China, we will need the cooperation of liberal and illiberal states alike. It is only through these types of networks that we are going to be able to build the counter-leverage we need to preserve a regional and global order consistent with our interests. In other words, we should be prepared to ally ourselves with anyone, irrespective of their legitimacy or policies, to try to contain China. One couldn't be more hypocritical given our public statements about the importance of human rights. I should add that the same defence brief barely touches on security risks posed by climate change, even though we know, as defence FOI requests show us, that defence is already planning for extreme climate change impacts. It references the need to prepare for significantly more disaster support operations and potentially operations involving support to the civil powers, such as policing the population under exaggerated stresses, such as food and water security. My concerns about a militarised response to the consequences of climate change were heightened when it was reported in September last year that a new civil defence agency will be housed under the Department of Home Affairs to lead a national response to emergencies such as bushfires, pandemics, and large-scale cyber attacks. Shortly afterwards, Home Affairs Secretary Michael Pezzullo said that climate change risks and pandemics warrant a security rethink. It then emerged that national security risks sparked by climate change have prompted the Bureau of Meteorology to forge ties with the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, and that the Bureau is now part of an international group sharing weather information with an impact on national security. More importantly, in 2019, General Angus Campbell gave a speech in which he warned what the world could expect to see from climate change. In about 10 years from now, he said, global warming above pre-industrial levels is set to rise by 50%. At 1.5 degrees of warming, we can expect more significant impacts, particularly in regards to oceans, low-lying areas, and human health. The poor and most vulnerable will be hardest hit, livelihoods lost, food scarce, populations displaced, diseases spreading, and this now looks like our best case scenario. Which brings me to the question I've been contemplating: how do you stop a war? When I asked my 2-year-old son this, he responded, I don't know. In fact, I don't think many people do. It's an important question to consider and try and find answers to. In January 2003, GCHQ translator Catherine Gunn tried to stop the Iraq invasion by leaking to the press the plan for an illegal US-UK spy operation, which would secure UN authorization for the invasion. She was charged under the Official Secrets Act. Daniel Hale leaked information on US drone warfare to the press and was sentenced to 45 months in prison. Chelsea Manning spent 7 years in prison for leaking classified information to WikiLeaks, including about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Julian Assange remains in a supermax prison, and Ed Snowden remains in exile for their roles in the publication of material in the public interest. In other words, the price paid for trying to stop a war is too high for any individual. If we are to stop wars, it must involve many people working collaboratively, endlessly, and all against the reality that our political leaders won't debate or even weigh up costs and benefits. Instead, they defer to violence using a moral justification of sacred values, subjective beliefs or convictions that trump all other considerations, but which can't be accurately described or quantified. We're up against the profit motives of weapons manufacturers, industrialists, bankers, and others. And we're up against government secrecy and war propaganda. Polls show that Australians do not want conflict with China. So we need to fund further independent polls to get a comprehensive and accurate picture of public opinion. We need to bolster DFAT and diplomatic engagement. We need to provide resources for independent media and reputable voices in the Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific to keep us informed about what is happening on the ground and to provide a counter-narrative to those working against diplomatic settlements. And we need to elevate the voices of First Nations peoples who are opposed to the use of their land for military purposes. And I use the Arnhem Space Station in that example because there is some evidence to suggest that the full disclosure of the use of that site might not have been made to traditional owners in a language that they understood. We know the Afghanistan war will prompt the US to examine how to fight the next war more cheaply and with less other costs or fallout. Those plans will already be in the making in secrecy. Here in Australia, many organisations are working collaboratively towards making Australia, pushing Australia towards a peaceful, independent future, including Australian War Powers Reform, which is seeking to reform the war powers under which the executive government can commit troops internationally, They're campaigning for independent reviews of Australia's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and public reports on all aspects of them. I think open parliamentary voting, preferably conscious voting, on any decision to go to war would ensure that defence and foreign policy decisions are decided democratically, independently of the United States, and with evidence being tabled and the purpose, costs, benefits, and consequences of military action openly debated. Each representative would have to account to their electorate for their vote. Independent and Peaceful Australia Inquiry is a current national public inquiry into the costs and consequences of the Australia-US alliance for the Australian people. It invites proposals that could help to achieve a genuinely independent and peaceful foreign policy for Australia. Hundreds of submissions, which is incredible, have been received, and recurring themes and consistent messages are already emerging. But one theme that is ubiquitous throughout the submissions and bears repeating is that war is a choice rather than an inevitability in defence and foreign policy decisions, and the consequences can be grave. This is evidenced by what we have seen play out in Afghanistan. Diplomacy was shelved there 20 years ago when we decided to follow the US in going to war, and the immense costs to everyone involved significantly outweighed any benefit of having done so. The submissions have highlighted that the Australian public has been sidelined from the debate relating to Australia's defence and foreign policy decisions, particularly in relation to its alliance with the United States. Our foreign policy is rarely publicly discussed, let alone democratically decided, and has bipartisan support. And this is despite the obvious popular interest in the area. The reluctance of politicians to offer new policy and the influence of lobbyists who are not pursuing Australia's interests is of great concern to the public. All of these things confirm a yawning gap between public attitudes and government policies. Many people have contributed to this inquiry, the first of its kind, giving people a chance to have their say on the matter. The volume of submissions the inquiry has received indicates that findings based on them will be representative of the views held by the majority of concerned Australians. And most of them recognise that Australia's current trajectory destines us to a future of conflict. The inquiry's findings, when published, will be of considerable historical significance. First, as an historical reference point for those who in the future will assess the efficacy of our government's decisions and actions. And secondly, as a clarion call for the use of reason, diplomacy, and the common sense of the electorate and all of our elected representatives in making decisions about alliances and warfare in what really are Australia's best interests. The report will be published and launched in February, and we can circulate it through IPB. Although I don't claim to know how to stop a war, may I suggest that the key to doing so lies in popular involvement. If people make themselves heard in sufficient numbers, politicians listen and governments react. If pro-war rhetoric and propaganda are critically dissected for people, their peddlers may not desist, but at least they'll be called out, exposed and hopefully ignored. We should draw strength from the knowledge that most thinking people like you are actually already on the same page. What we need to do is mobilise them. Thank you for your time.
Excellent. Thank you, Kellie. I hope people can hear me because everything else is frozen for me. But in any case, Kellie, I think, that discussion was really great. And in particular, the overview of what the inquiry is covering and seeking to do and will do as it's moves forward into final phases, and also the reflections, I think, in looking forward as well, which is so important. And continuing down that line, we will shift gears by going to now speak to different initiatives or efforts that are taking place in the region and beyond. And to start this discussion, we have a group of students from Macquarie University who are doing a project with Medical Association for Prevention of War, convened by Elise West. And so I will hand over to her to introduce the project and the student group to shift us over into hearing about some of the great work that's being done to counter, I guess, the issues we've heard laid out.
Hi, thanks Matilda. My name's Elise West. I'm the Executive Officer of Medical Association for Prevention of War, or MAPW. I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri, Wurrung and Burrung people of the Kulin Nations. If you don't know us, MAPW is a national network of medical workers. Our members work from a basis of medical ethics to prevent the harms of war and militarism, and action on the Australian arms trade is a core piece of work for us. The Australian arms trade is one expression of the increasing militarisation of Australia, and one that has terrible and very harmful consequences for people. Australia exports arms under almost blanket secrecy. What we do know is often due to the efforts of people like Kellie, who chip away at the gaps to extract information that would otherwise not be available to us. And our government doesn't conduct proper end-use monitoring either. We don't know what Australia exports, to whom, or ultimately how it's used. We really want to change the public's attitude to Australia's trade in arms and ultimately disrupt our trade in arms by telling a compelling story about the direct and indirect harm it causes to people. But the question for us is, when so much information is kept secret, how can this be done? So we asked a team of third-year Macquarie University students to turn their minds to this. Today, they're presenting their work in progress. Welcome to Mitty, Jade, Alex, and Asil, and you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Elise. So MAPW has asked us to reframe their existing work on Australia's arms trade, with the core concern being the harm caused by the trade itself. So by developing a compelling narrative of Australia's role in perpetrating harm through arms exports, our group intends on rallying the public to demand for the Australian government's accountability in these issues. So firstly, I wish to pose a question to everybody here. True or false? The public knows exactly what Australia is exporting in arms, where it is going, and what it is being used for. If you said false, you are absolutely correct. Truth be told, we do not know much about the trade due to it being completely shrouded in secrecy. What we do know is that Australia is building a $1 billion arms export industry. The Defence Export Strategy created by the Australian government outlines its ambition to make Australia a top 10 global defence exporter. Statistics have shown that the estimated approved export permits increased from 1.5 billion in 2017 to 5.5 billion in 2019. In an attempt to become a frontrunner in this area, Australia has made a number of military shipments to Saudi Arabia and UAE, countries which have instigated the Yemen crisis. This crisis has been labelled as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, and recent reports by the UN High Commissioner have documented that numerous war crimes have been committed by these countries. So what is Australia's role in this? Documents such as the Freedom of Information requests have revealed that the nation has issued 42 licenses to export military or dual-use equipment to these countries. Although the Australian government has claimed on multiple occasions that all exports are provided in accordance with the Arms Trade Treaty, the secrecy surrounding them makes it impossible to have confidence that these exports are not causing public harm. So the Arms Trade Treaty is a multilateral agreement which establishes common global standards for national regulation of the international trade in conventional arms. It encourages states to trade arms more transparently in order to prevent the destabilizing impact the arms trade has on human suffering. It states that all nations shall take measures necessary to have an effective and transparent national control system regulating the transfer of conventional arms. State parties are required to submit annual reports on transfers, their quantity or value, as well as the final importing state. Moreover, the treaty explicitly demands that state parties put upholding human rights law and international humanitarian law at the core of their arms export decisions. Thus, transparency is central to the effective implementation of the treaty, as it has the ability to advance human security and protect public health. Although the Australian government has ratified the treaty, it has failed to disclose most information. What is not publicly available is how many weapons have been sold, to whom, for how much, or for what purpose, on the basis that this information is commercial in confidence. In the quarterly data reports produced by the Department of Defence, it can be seen that they provide a total value of approved arms export licenses broken down by destination region. However, unhelpfully, it maps regions like Middle East and Asia together, rendering the data useless. Due to this lack of transparency, the public is unaware of Australia's role in contributing to serious harm in nations such as Yemen. Thus, advocating for transparency in this arena is vital in order to ensure good governance, accountability, and to overall ensure public health is protected.
Thanks for that, Mitty. All right, I'm just going to take off on my section as well. To comprehend the reality of this harm inflicted on countries targeted by Australian arms exports, we've included a public health lens, which, while extrapolating the need to educate the public in order to facilitate governmental and policy changes, also emphasizes gender as an important context in which to analyze this harm, which is my focus in this project. And much like Mitty, I'd love to pose a question. True or false, armed combatants are the most vulnerable group to harm during armed conflicts. Unfortunately, with MAPW's previous studies having proven more than 70% of casualties in recent international conflicts are civilians and mostly women and children, armed combatants are clearly not the most vulnerable group. The statistic supports public health centralization of gender violence into their preventative war efforts, and I have included MAPW's summary of the reality of this harm within the report to indicate what we are trying to prevent. And I'm just going to list a couple of these dot points off now to get a better picture of the gender violence that is perpetrated under arms trade. So more than half of these, those indicted at the International Criminal Court have been charged with rape and sexual assault. Most child victims of this sexual violence are girls. Women have also endured forced pregnancy, abduction, and enslavement. Up to 80% of all refugees are women and children who suffer from food shortages and lack of healthcare. Displaced children are at a high risk of malnutrition and disease. Complications arising during childbirth are the leading cause of death, and women and children affected by war often experience great difficulty in reintegrating into post-war society. With the Department of Defence's confirmation that Australia is exporting to nations utilising arms on civilian populaces, especially in conflict zones like Syria and the previously mentioned Yemen, the argument that these forms of gender violence have been aided by the Australian arms trade is built. This harm has been excused through ideologies such as imperial feminism, which encourages the dominant Western narrative of a crusade for those less fortunate than the West, namely by saving Eastern women from their archaically patriarchal society. While I've not finalized this section in the project, I've ensured to use the works of the academics like Lila Abu Lehod to understand how the contextualization of the East by the West, following the engagement with the war on terrorism, the lack of accountability from Australia, as well as the normalization of these policies through colonialism, has created this narrative. Contrasting this with the previously mentioned reality of harm created by arms, we can challenge the dominant narrative and begin to call for greater accountability from the government. This necessity of education to facilitate change is a core tenet of public health that is to be further explained by Alex in the next section.
So before introducing public health and psychological impacts, I would like to pose another question. True or false? Do we as a community know the central cause of harm within armed conflicts? I'll give you a moment to think about that. The answer is false. Through public health and by providing a psychological input, armed conflict is known to cause human suffering through injuries, psychological and emotional damage, environmental damage, economic impacts, as well as communal disasters, in which this is recognized globally. However, the answer for what the central cause of harm is still remains unknown. With this in mind, Australia's secrecy has not been able to provide in-depth findings of public health in regards to psychological inputs of arms trade. Therefore, the call for transparency in order to reduce the harms of combats. In literature and articles found by Amnesty International, it was recognized that the human costs of armed conflicts play a detrimental role in public health. It was confirmed that through a 10-year gap of 2006 to 2016, there has been over 2 million children killed in armed conflict, over 6 million injuries, and countless other individuals and children who have been forced to witness and take part of violence. With this, it continues to rise as years go on. Within this department, the right to health has been taken away from these individuals, and it has also affected their right to an education, as there is a lack of the military role within international conflicts. This is contested by public health as its role and purpose is to protect and improve population well-being, therefore the people's right to an education, as well as to create a sustainable environment for current and future generations. Individuals are able to feel motivated to prevent the harm when there is a direct link to an event or a passion or drive for the certain matter. By introducing an individual who has experienced the harm by the Australian arms trade firsthand, it allows many people to be drawn to the experience. Future generations are able to feel motivated to prevent this harm by simply simplifying and effectively communicating these routes in which an everyday person can protest against the harm created through these arms trade. We believe the means of achieving this is through the Australian government's transparency.
As my fellow group members have articulated, Australia's arms trade is wrapped in secrecy. While Australia has openly expressed its ambitions in becoming one of the world's top 10 weapons exporters, they fail to provide any information on the logistics of achieving such a position, hiding behind, as Mitty claimed, the commercial in confidence. The conventional view among international relations scholars is that strategic consideration is a leading factor for states. Decisions regarding whether to provide alliance commitments or arms sales to client states focus primarily on the commonality of security interests and the local military balance, to therefore determine which bundles of military assistance to offer client states. In saying so, we can recognize that policymakers treat arms sales as a valued instrument of foreign policy in strengthening military capabilities of allies and at the same time achieving economic benefit. While Australia hasn't achieved much of a breakthrough on its export rankings, it has appreciated its impressive sales success. Such profits, however, cast doubt upon how Australia has achieved such accomplishment. Australia claims that its arms export industry operates under strict regulation. The government expresses that in keeping with Australia's national interests and international obligations, defense facilitates the responsible exports of military and dual-use goods and technologies from Australia. If such claims are true, why do we still have such secrecy shrouding our exports? Academic scholars have asserted that the element of risk sensitivity is heavily disregarded, and in Australia's case, practically hidden, much like everything else. Field experts have articulated that all arms transfers, including those with important strategic rationales, carry the risk of negative strategic and humanitarian consequences, which is why it is believed that every arms sale is thus a calculated gamble that the expected strategic and economic benefits will outweigh the potential costs. A prime example of this can be seen through Australia's arms trade to the war in Yemen. There is large conjecture of human rights breaches which can be attributed to the sale of Australia's weapons and funding the war. Earlier this year, the Biden administration declared a freeze on offensive arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE after the UN Secretary General anticipated that 16 million Yemenis will go hungry this year because of conflict, while 50,000 Yemenis are already starving to death, and by reason of such, other nations such as Italy and Germany followed suit. However, in Australia's case, due to the lack of transparency, we have yet to hear or see a thing. Former Federal Labor Minister of Australia and United Nations lawyer Melissa Park expressed Australia is ruining its reputation, as Australia would rather seek to increase the manufacture and sale of weapons that cause injury, death, and destruction to people who have done us no harm by selling munitions and military technologies to countries accused of gross human rights violations. If Australia stands by its claims of responsible exports and honors the treaty it's signatory to, there is no need for such secrecy, as it cannot be guilty to the harmful effects of trade. As seen throughout the entire presentation, the secrecy of arms trade has facilitated harm in all capacities of public health. In order to instigate change, we must educate and enlighten the world on these issues. This presentation has been a stepping stone in developing a compelling narrative in combating this global issue, and our project will continue this mission. I will leave you with a quote from Tim Costello, the world's vision chief of Australia. There is only one purpose in making a weapon, and that is to kill someone with it. Do we really want that to be what people think of when they see the brand Made in Australia? Thank you. We now welcome any questions and feedback you may have.
Excellent. Thank you so much to the team for sharing with us your project and the research, and indeed all of the work that you're doing. It's really great to hear about, and arms exports is such a problematic area, as you've touched on in so many ways. And I think now we are at that part of the workshop where we can have a more interactive discussion and invite people listening as well to share about any other initiatives or particular action that you're taking in in the context of sort of demilitarization in Asia-Pacific region or beyond. And so what I would do is I'd invite people to ask any questions they have, whether it's also on, I guess, the discussion as well, using the Q&A function in the Wova platform. And you can also raise your hand. So if you have particular questions for any of the panelists or the presenters, and we actually already have a couple that have accumulated. So just to get us going, perhaps we will just find a moment now to talk a little bit more about AUKUS. I know Vince already started mentioning some of the implications for the region, but some of the specific things people have asked about that agreement also include potential impacts for lives of people and the environment, and also whether it is just kind of a way to package a benefit of the arms and weapons industry, and what the public reaction to the agreement has been, or how it's being portrayed in mainstream media. So if someone wants to jump in there, and then like I said, I'm use this time as well to put in any questions that you might have, or raise your hand if you wish.
So yeah, I'm happy to start on that one, Matilda, and thank you very much for the questions. So I might start with the last one first, which is how has the AUKUS agreement been framed in the mainstream media in Australia, and what's been the public reaction? It's been a pretty poor response from the media, in my opinion, in terms of critically assessing the deal. There's been a lot about the technical aspects of the deal. There's been a lot about the costs involved, which of course are significant. There has been a lot of discussion about the diplomatic fallout from abandoning the original French non-nuclear submarine deal with a Naval group, and the way that was carried out. There's been a lot about the benefits that nuclear submarines could bring to Australia. But there has been virtually nothing on the core issue, in my opinion, which is what I raised in my presentation, which was the way that this deal binds Australia to the United States' war plans with respect to China, and in particular, how controversial it is and provocative it is from a Chinese perspective for Australia to be purchasing nuclear-powered submarines, which it is clear would only be purposefully used in a contingency in the South China Sea against China. And as I mentioned in my presentation, given China's concerns and vulnerabilities with respect to its second strike nuclear capability, the decision for Australia to be purchasing submarines, which may very well contribute to undermining that second strike capability in a war, would be incredibly alarming from China, and I think is why we've seen the reaction from China that we have. From what I've seen, Australian public opinion polls, it's hard to tell because this, like I said, the media hasn't done a really good job of explaining the costs of the deal. But from the public opinion polls I've seen, a majority of Australians have said that they support the negotiation of the deal. Although it's a little bit confused, because then when you ask further questions about do you think the deal improves Australia's security, it's less than 50%. More than 50% think it doesn't do anything to improve Australia's security. So there's probably a little bit of confusion there as well. There has been a significant movement from civil society in response to the deal. I mean, there's been an incredible number of forums, mainly via Zoom because of the COVID situation, but credible connections and networks that are being created. And of course, here the potential to bridge the gap between the peace movement and the environment movement, which has needed to happen for quite a long time as a result of the potential nuclear proliferation elements of the AUKUS agreement, which I haven't spoken to yet. I'm more than happy to, but I know I've been speaking for a long time already. So yeah, if someone wants to ask a further question about the nuclear proliferation elements of the agreement, I can mention that too. In terms of defence, there was a question about the defence industry. Yes, the military industrial complex is always there in the background. Certainly, I mentioned that the AUKUS agreement partly is about creating a mutual defence pool, linking Australia with American global supply chains, and with the UK. Certainly in the United States, there's been those who have been lobbying for greater capacity for their submarine production. The US is already producing, I think, 2 Virginia-class submarines per year, and it's going to be taking on a third a submarine production when the Columbia-class submarine comes online in a few years' time. So they're going to be at capacity, and they've been, the industry has been lobbying for the expansion of that capacity. And so I'm sure that is all playing a factor. But I think the main driving issue here is the strategic considerations, which I mentioned before. I hope that answered most or all of the questions.
It definitely did, yes. But does anyone else want to add anything to that? Kellie, did you have?
Yeah, look, the only thing I would add to that very fine explanation from Vince is, look, it was an overnight dump that we were going to join this AUKUS alliance. There was no public consultation. It was framed by the politicians as making us safe. And of course, they know that when they float those sorts of lines, they win over a very scared population. Anything that makes us feel safe, we agree with. And then, of course, the polls get taken after these lines get thrown out like a ball gets dropped, and the polls are in favour of an alliance. And no one in the media is sort of, or certainly in the mainstream media, say, look, let's just pause for a second and let's just reflect on what's happened for the past 20 years in Afghanistan, and let's just work out what went wrong. And so that there's no critical analysis being done, and it's sort of just this continuum. And I think that's why we need to really focus on getting those independent polls done, because they do get traction. And it's about asking the right questions of the Australian public. If they thought that this deal would facilitate further American involvement in the political process, they might not be happy with it. If it made us a nuclear target, even more so than we already are, they might not agree with it at all. So it's pushing back against the lines that get dropped out overnight in the chaos of the news cycle. So I would just add that in and stress the importance of funding and getting those independent polls out there.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really important point to raise, and not unrelated to another question that we have, which is from Maggie, who said, where is the Achilles heel in all of this rather complex and daunting militarization? And also a separate, I guess, question around the work of the Macquarie research team, and that it would be really valuable to be able to access any reports or, I suppose, final outputs. And so just a question on that as well, and staying in the loop.
So I guess for us addressing the point about needing to stay in the loop and all that sort of stuff, we were asked to bring in a public health lens, and one of the biggest key points we pulled from that was the fact that demilitarization and any chance at preventing like aggressive war attempts or even occupation of other countries under the guise of, fighting for our freedom or whatever, it's often like the way to do that is to educate the public on what's going on, like the reality of it all, which is what we're attempting to do in discussing the Australian arms trade. But it is this issue of like, well, we need to educate because the dominant narrative that is given in the West is like, we are the good guys, which is often why we always, like, we go to war and it's not discussed the reality of like why, these countries are going to war. Why are we occupying troops in these other nations and stuff like that? And it's because we keep creating this narrative of like the East versus the West. Like the West are the good guys, we're fighting for freedom, America's the lead in that. We, see America as this symbol of the West, like a superpower. And, they can't do wrong if they're fighting for our freedom kind of thing. And it gets to this point where it's like, you know, even in primary schools and high schools, and sometimes even at universities, they keep teaching the wrong version of history because they're like trying to stick to this narrative of like the West are the good guys. Like, I know in America it's very big that they discuss the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by means of being like, well, that's how they stopped the war. Like, the bombing stopped the war, not, you know, revealing the fact that, you know, troops were already leaving that area. They removed troops weeks ago. Like, Japan was going to give up. And it's that same sort of narrative being applied to, you know, the Arabic world, where they're like, oh, well, you know, they need our help, the West, because they're constantly being taken over by terrorists. And it's just this generalization that allows them to perpetrate harm. And, you know, that's not going to stop unless we actually talk about the truth of it all, which is, you know, our project is just one small facet of trying to work towards that, I guess. I hope that was worthwhile.
And Matilda, just to add to that, the work of the students is working towards a standalone site, which will kind of be a point of activism on the Australian arms trade. Stay tuned, we're not quite there yet. But meanwhile, you can visit us at mapw.org.au for the work that we're doing on that issue.
Excellent. Thank you, Jade and Elise. And I guess now to the...
Sorry, Matilda, I know you, there was the question about what's the Achilles heel of the whole issue. So, yeah. So I just like to address maybe one aspect of that. I think the Achilles heel in this is time. So, although I stressed in my remarks how grave an implication this is for Australia, it's the reality is that Australia's probably not going to get its first nuclear submarine for a decade or two. We've also, there's also, although the deal was presented to us, as Kellie mentioned, as a kind of fait accompli, not whether we should have nuclear powered submarines, but we are going to get them. And now we're going to spend the next 18 months working out the details. I don't think we necessarily have to accept those terms of reference. We can challenge the deal itself and use the time that we have before then to challenge that. We were in a deal with France for 5 years. We spent a couple of $1 billion on it, and that deal fell apart. So maybe we can take hope that if one deal can be renounced, then maybe the second one can as well. The other area for hope is, as I mentioned before, I think it's created quite a pushback from civil society, created opportunities for links between different parts of civil society, particularly the peace movement, but also the environment movement. I think those calls, particularly from the environment movement, would likely to get louder, as I expect, and as already is the case, that this agreement will be a thin edge of the wedge to try and get Australia to develop a nuclear powered sector in Australia. Already those calls are being made by the nuclear industry. And then, you know, it's potentially even a slippery slope from there on to nuclear weapons. I know that sounds kind of extraordinary, but in the last few years, there's already been discussions by noted defence pundits about Australia having to think about having the discussion about maybe one day in the future getting nuclear weapons if the strategic situation were to deteriorate, and that's a new development. You wouldn't have heard that kind of talk even five or 10 years ago. So you know, as things get worse, there are opportunities. There's opportunities in crisis, I guess, is what I'm saying. But also, yeah, there is I think time that we have within which to challenge this.
I would only add to that, I believe there's a very strong case to be made of a focus on Pine Gap. I think politicians are very awkward when they infrequently get asked questions about Pine Gap. No Senate committee can properly examine it. We know it's not in our national interests. We know it doesn't protect America's national security. We know that it can be terminated. There's an end. There's an inclusion of clause that ends it. So a few more FOIs, a few more sort of poking around to see what surfaces. And for the students doing this fine work, if there's an opportunity to do a test case challenging the commercial in confidence aspect, in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. I think that's probably the jurisdiction you go. A lot of these cases are being overturned now because the reductions are being made to conceal all the embarrassing information, and it gets to that level and it does in fact get overturned. So, but there's never been a test case on commercial in confidence, and that's the sort of stuff that you will need to kind of unravel what's being done, because otherwise you'll get pages and pages and pages of blank reams of paper of blank documents. And you'll probably find a pro bono barrister that would be happy to run a case like that, but you'll have to issue your FOI first and then get your knockback and then challenge it and take it all the way.
Great. And are there any other questions? You can put them in the Q&A or just simply raise your hand as well if you have anything else you want to discuss or comment on, or like we said earlier, if there's something that you're working on or you want to share efforts that are being done where you are or with an organisation, so on and so forth. Please take the opportunity now as well to raise your hand or put something in the chat.
I just might add to why people are asking questions, Matilda. Just another thought came to my mind in terms of the Achilles heel of this. I did mention that it seems that initial polls indicate that Australians seem to be at least initially supporting this, or 65% of Australians, although the polls are somewhat confused. It's also true, as Kellie mentioned, that when specific questions are asked about should Australia become involved in a war with the United States or with China in a contingency in the South China Sea or in the East China Sea with Japan or over Taiwan, overwhelmingly Australians say no. All right, so there's this disconnect between the fact that we're supporting Pine Gap, where's support for US military forces in Australia, there's support for the AUKUS deal, even though those agreements tie Australia to the very contingencies that most Australians overwhelmingly argue that we should not become involved in. And I think pushing that kind of connection, or making that connection and making that argument is one way to address public opinion about this.
Absolutely. And I see Annette from IPAN, you've got your hand up. Do you want to take the floor?
Yeah, it's been really a fantastic forum to hear all these different points of view, and to hear from the students at Macquarie has been amazing, as well as Kellie and Vince, as always. One of the things that I think, given that this is a European forum, and I know we've got people joining us on this forum from Barcelona, I'd like to ask one of our speakers to comment on how AUKUS actually has repercussions outside of the region. What's it doing to the allies of Europe and the US and the UK, and what's it doing to any semblance of world stability, and particularly also those countries in the Asia-Pacific. I know that there's been great concern expressed from many of the Pacific nations, leaders and people, as well as throughout the Southeast Asian region. But I think, given that we've got European people joining us tonight, I think that would be interesting to have a little bit of exploration of those impacts. Thanks. Who'd like to take that?
I mean, I think those in the audience from Europe might be a better place to answer that question than might from us here in Australia. But yeah, I mean, one of the interpretations of Australia's joining of the AUKUS pact, along with the US and the UK, is that this is kind of a throwback to the old Anglosphere. The United States and Australia and the UK obviously have a long-standing relationship with one another that goes back to colonial times. Australia supposedly had undergone a shift in the 1980s and 1990s towards integrating more with Asia. There's been a lot of discussion and talk about Australia finding security within Asia instead of against Asia. And this is just, it really is a throwback to that old kind of colonial style mentality and that fear that is deep seated in Australian culture, in history, which Kellie mentioned before, which political leaders find expedient opportunities to tap into. In terms of Europe, I mean, we've seen the damage already between France and the US, and France and the UK. The French withdrew their ambassador from Australia and the US. They didn't withdraw their ambassador from the UK, interestingly enough. I think that's partly because they recognise that the UK is just, although it's presenting itself as a global power, is really just a third-rate power now, trying to be a first-rate power. But I think the consequences are for the transatlantic alliance between the US and Europe. I think there is potential fissures there because of Europe's significant trade relationship with China. The same kind of security concerns that the United States, or security concerns, power projection concerns that the United States has with respect to the Indo-Pacific, are very different to the kinds of security concerns that Europe have with respect to China. And we've already seen this, particularly with respect to the attempts by the United States to economically isolate China. It's getting a lot of cooperation from Australia, but less so in Europe, apart from the UK. So I think the budding kind of Cold War between the US and China is playing out very differently from the perspective of Europe than the old Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union.
I think it's an important question, Annette. I think not just our defence decisions, but many of our foreign policy decisions sort of find us morally diminished in the eyes of many countries. I think China will wait it out to see what happens politically with if we see a new government elected in the not too distant future. At the moment, I think they have just wiped their hands of the Morrison government, and they at one point extended their hands to talk diplomatically, and of course that's not being picked up by the current elected representatives in power. So I think they'll wait it out. I think the Europeans are mortified by the conduct of Australia on many different fronts, as they should be. And I would encourage our European friends to actively criticise our country, rain down from an international perspective on our decisions, because all of that helps feed into the campaigns on the ground domestically. So I think it's I think we're viewed as a vassal state. We're locked in with the United States. I think it's absurd to suggest that we balance trade, our economic interests, with our defence interests. I think anyone in the Chinese government would laugh at that proposition. So, I think we're probably viewed very astutely and accurately by our friends overseas. And, now if we get a new government, there's a very small window when you get a new government because, they're sort of not seasoned. They haven't hit their straps. There's a very slight window to influence policy, both before the election and during that sort of that new period of, maybe 6 months or so, for campaigners to really attack at that point.
Great. Yeah, Kellie, I think there's some good remarks to sort of lead us into the end of the session, because I'm just looking at the time and noting as well that the next workshop is coming on. So I think, thank you to all of the presenters and to Annette and Ross and IPAN for organising the workshop today. I think there are, really serious issues that have been outlined and discussed, but also really positive work going on. So it was really encouraging to hear about the People's Inquiry and the rich information source and sort of public mobilizing, I suppose, coming out of that, as well as the efforts on arms exports that the students are doing. So with all of that in mind, thank you so much everyone also for attending today, and you can stay connected via the WOVA platform if you wish and reach out to people, and we hope to be able to do more of that and collaborate as we move on. And if you're attending other workshops and parts of the Congress, do enjoy those. There's great speakers lined up for the rest of the weekend. So thanks very much, everyone.